bones. She put it all back by the doctrine of lies. To fuck to mentions, I shall pass to me as I make my way through to the promised land.
So, episode 6 today.
Yeah.
Are you ready, Luís?
Let's go.
I will kick off now. So, hello to all. Hello, dear listeners and watchers, viewers. Hello, dear Luís. Nice to see you again. And today we continue our journey with Slavoj Zizek, a book that we had put aside for at least 2 episodes, if I'm right. We had one episode about immediacy. There was the previous one. And then before that, we had one about interpassivity, 2 concepts which we related to each other somehow. But now, finally, we are back on track with this amazing book that we are trying to scrutinize very deeply somehow. At the same time, I think we also try to offer a reading that, let's say, would push or prepare people for their own readings. It's maybe also meant as an introduction to the book, as our own working through the book. I think it's also this, it's almost a sort of, it has a sort of testimonial character. I think every time we appear on screen, it's the moment when we, let's say, punctuate our labor through another chapter of this book. And I think we always appear in the middle of some struggles and troubles. It's not that we appear with some enlightened visions on the book. On the contrary, I think also, again, the chapter we are going to tackle today, which is about symptoms. The symptom, it's called From Symptom to Symptom, to use the French pronunciation. It's a symptomal and symptomatic chapter. And I think we have been also in a very symptomatic way been attacked by our own and each other's symptoms. And well, there is absolutely a sort of self-referential element there. So that's interesting. And just to comfort the listeners and the viewers also that what we are talking about is not certainty, but these are, like, let's say, proposals. These are struggles, as I said already. And maybe to really kick off today, I think it's interesting to know for the people who maybe for the first time start to read the book The Sublime Object of Ideology by Slavoj Zizek, or dive again into the book, that when you start to read chapter 2, I think it is, From Symptom to Symptom, or if you would, of course, the pun, this is something very Lacanian. These are 2 terminologies, two terms that come from Lacan, from the Freudian Lacanian tradition. If you would say it in the English way, from symptom to symptôme, or in the French, you would say from symptôme to symptôme. So there is a slight pronunciation difference. You see already, well, let's say the slight difference we are going to work around today. It's about 2 concepts which look very similar, and there is nevertheless a sort of a chronological working through these 2 concepts, from, you can say, from symptom to symptom. but they somehow operate also in this notion of difference, of very, very, it's like it's like as if the first concept of symptom gave way by a huge working through to the second concept. And if you start to read the chapter, as often with Žižek, you immediately dive into the middle of things, in medias res, which is pleasant for some people, but for some people it's anxiety provoking. And in fact, he doesn't start with a clear explanation of what symptom is. He also doesn't say anything about what, in a nutshell, how Lacan or even Freud before Lacan goes from symptom to symptom. He immediately starts about the temporal quality of the symptom and the weird, let's say, almost science fiction like character of the symptom. And so you are immediately bombarded with these temporality problems of the symptom, and it's only after, I would almost dare to say, 20 pages even, so that's quite a lot, that Žižek seems to take a little step back and gives you on page, we are then already, so the chapter starts on page 57, but then we are already on page 79. On page 79 is for the first time that we, after 20 pages of confusion and complexity, you get a sort of summary, a sort of status quo, and where he a little bit through the process of Lacan himself, the career of Lacan himself, Jacques Lacan, this psychoanalyst, he tries to give a summary of how we move from symptom to symptom. So, and that's something that I could imagine you could even read that first. You could maybe go to page 79, 80 and 81 and read these pages first. Even if you still don't get much of it after a first reading, it may be helpful. And then you go back to the beginning. I propose that we will start from the beginning, but let me say something just in a very general way, what a symptom is, or how you could describe it. Why are we talking about symptoms even? What is a symptom doing? As you all probably know, symptom has to do with the clinic, with medical science, with going to the doctor and having some symptoms, which in general means little expressions which are annoying. This could be bodily expressions. This could be things that pop up in your way of doing. You feel that there is something abnormal, you can say, of your normal state or your normal condition. It could be also just a pain in the throat or a pain in your belly, whatever. That's what the doctor would call symptoms. Just to jump immediately to psychoanalysis, for psychoanalysis, symptom has this expressive character. There is something said through the symptom. It's something that talks, but you don't know what it really says. So it's a sort of enigmatic, hieroglyphic talk almost in a way. And at the same time, and that's very important, I think, and I think, Luís, you will immediately love, I guess, to pick up on that, is that the symptom has a sort of contrary identity too. Namely, there is always something also of what they call in psychoanalysis repression. So it means that there is something that the symptom moves to the front, but it moves also to the back at the same time. And so you have expression and repression. So that's already very important. So just to make one thing a little bit more complex, in the early works of Freud would say that symptoms appear as expressions of repression. So there is something repressed, what in common talk is also, everybody knows this term, what is called trauma. Somebody experiences something, there is something repressed of that, what happened there. And then and that's very important, the symptom is something that appears, it's not really reappearing, and here we are getting already into the temporality element, so it's not really reappearing because nothing else had yet appeared. So it's appearing, the symptom. And the question is, of what is this symptom as appearance the consequence or the effect? So as Lacan also, and Žižek repeats that very nicely, says the symptom is an effect that appears before the cause, right? It's something that first appears, and what you have to do is then decode, decipher what it means. And well, I think that's the first thing we have to talk about. I think also, and then I will end, and I give you the word, Luís, to take off on this temporality element, or if you still want to say other things, just on the basic notion of symptom. What I think is very important is that the first idea of symptom, and that connects it also to art history, culture in general, the social fields, socio-cultural theory, is that the symptom is an element that appears that needs decoding, that needs deciphering. That's the basic idea. This is a vast field already. I think we could have already 2-3 episodes just on how the decipherment of this symptom appears in different fields, in musicology, in art history, in anthropology, in philosophy proper, and so on. The second move, and I'm looking already forward for the second part of our program today, is that slowly Freud already, and Lacan for sure, will feel that something doesn't work here. And that's always when, I think psychoanalysis is always interested in these moments when things are not working anymore. Psychoanalysis is, I would say, if it's a science, we can also still discuss about that, but it is absolutely the theory, you can say, and the working through of something that doesn't work. And so the symptom appears as, in the beginning, as something easily to decipher, and slowly we not only start to see that we cannot get rid of these symptoms, because that would be the aim why we would decipher them. Not only we cannot get rid of them, they also continuously seem to reappear. And so something else, something much more disturbing, much more unheimlich, as Freud would say, is going on with these symptoms. So there is this, it's also interesting, I was already thinking about that Symptom resonates with fantôme, with the phantomal character of something. It's a strange presence. Symptoms are the things in us that we grappling with, that we are struggling with. We have them, and we don't know what to do with them. And so, well, okay, let's see what you have to say, Luís. I'm very curious.
Yeah, it's nice because you already somehow presented the entire chapter, and just before we get into the first sense of symptom, you just said something that made me think, that you mentioned how Symptom and Phantom sound the same, and it made me think, and this may be stupid, but it made me think about these phantom pains that we have, these things that hurt but that are not really ours. And that's really how a symptom works, no? Is that something that seems not to belong to you is disrupting your way of life, is causing you suffering, and therefore some enjoyment as well, but still that it seems external or extimate to yourself. Yeah, but to go back to the question of temporality, I think it is important first to say what trauma is, because people talk about a lot of traumatic experiences, and trauma cannot be defined as an experience. So the traumatic experience is already a contradiction. The trauma is the thing that cannot even be registered as an experience. So it is a non-experience. So the symptom, you go to the analyst and you complain about some symptoms you have, some behaviors you don't like about yourself, some things that don't seem to belong to you, but still you act on them. And it's not like he's going to the trauma to find the true meaning of the trauma itself, because the trauma is the absence of meaning. So to the first attempt to, let's say, cure a symptom is to put meaning where meaning does not exist. So it is a kind of time travel, as Žižek puts it, is that you try to add the meaning to the original experience, and through this interpretation, and you of course you start from the symptom, you try to relate it to something that happened in the past, you put meaning in this non-experience, where meaning doesn't exist, and the hope is that through this interpretation, the symptom loses some density in your behavior. We will see that it's rarely the case. Of course, some of this happens. Some of these symptoms alleviate or maybe even go away. But the point of this chapter is to show how your reality as yourself, as who you are, is undecipherable and impossible to take away. I think this is the passage from Symptom to Symptom that you were already introducing, that really matters, is that who you are also includes all these things that you don't want to accept. And there comes a point where you have to accept them, and you have to embrace these phantom pains as your own, really.
Yeah, that's interesting, and it immediately reminds me of the fact that that psychoanalysis, from the start, you could say, emerges as almost a sort of historical science. No, like it's almost a science, or well, I call it now a science. We can doubt that if it's really a science. Whatever, it's a theory, a practice, maybe even a praxis. It's a praxis of history, but even more meta-historical than historiography itself, almost, because it not only tries to understand something that eventually happened in the past, but it immediately, in a sort of meta-discourse, tries to understand how we understand things from the past, how the past as past really works. And so what I always find fascinating, and there are, of course, for sure in the last part of the 20th century, and also still today, many historians now who are taking very serious the endeavors of Freud. I think, for example, of Dominique Lacapra, for example, who is an historian who is very important for trauma history, Second World War, and so on, where he absolutely uses Freud and Lacan, because they see the need to not only understand history as some facts that happened, but also facts that didn't happen, or that happened but we cannot talk about them, or they were repressed, or they happened but they are so traumatic that they can only be thought as phantasmatic structures, or they can only be thought as symptoms later on. And so just to say that Freud also, I think, understood that, and he immediately saw his own psychoanalytic praxis as what he called a meta-psychology. And I think this is the Freud also that interests us a lot. It's not the Freud only of the clinical studies, but it's the Freud who moves to an attempt to make of psychoanalytic praxis a cultural study, in fact, and a study, a field of sociopsychology, cultural phenomena, which are linked to a symptomatology, you can almost say. And I think even to link it then to Žižek, I would almost dare to say that Žižek's theory in general is a sort of social symptomatology, in fact. If you don't want to call it a philosophy proper, because there are many people who try to somehow deconstruct what he does, that it's not philosophy proper and so on. Well, I think for us it's not very important, this discussion. But what is absolutely true is that and I think this was also clear in the previous episodes already, that what he tries to do is to literally put the finger on the wound, put the finger on the symptom. Because I think also when we talk about symptoms, this is something that is very important also, and that is, Freud says that from the beginning, symptoms are in themselves already a mechanism of health, you can say. I think we should stress that also already from the beginning. I think that symptoms are not just things we have to get rid of. You can say symptoms, and that's a typical Freudian move. When even Freud talks about psychosis, he would see that in this same idea that psychosis is not just becoming mad and getting out of a normal state of being. It is to cope. It's a certain coping mechanism. It's a way to survive, in fact, and so what he says about psychosis would also count for symptoms. Symptoms are already a mechanism of coping, you can say. So I think it's very important to stress also already now that the first thing to do is to recognize the symptoms, to create a symptomatology, and to put the finger on the wound, as I said already. Like, it means that like a subject who would go to an analyst or to even a doctor and would say, look, I have these symptoms. Saying your own symptoms, being able to talk about your symptoms, seeing the symptoms of history, seeing the symptoms of ideology, I would almost dare to say that's the first work to be done. It's mapping the symptoms. It's a sort of cartography of symptoms, in fact. And maybe this step is even more important than the interpretation. And I think we will come to that. It's also already what you suggested before, that there is something, let's say, that will come after, something uncurable about the symptoms. Symptoms have to do with enjoyment, with the fact that something else is going on than just pure meaning, than the level of meaning. And yeah, I think for us, what interests us a lot is the field of history, the field of culture, the field of art. Symptoms on the level of not just only meaning, but on the level of enjoyment, and how that plays into works of art, how that plays into historical phenomena, in the reception of the past, in the return of the past. I think this is primordial also for everything we are trying to think through.
Yeah, and it's funny because one of the first things, because as I think we already said it in the first episode, because I was your student in Basel a few years ago, and one of the first things I remember you telling that puzzled me, among many things, was that you said something like, I read Freud as an historian. And at the time, this, for someone who had a very superficial idea of what Freud stood for, this was a bit confusing. And this chapter clarifies, in a way, why Freud can be read as an historian, and especially through Lacan, because I think Freud himself would probably not be so sure that you could socialize his theory. But Lacan, I mean, if Freud is an historian, then Lacan is I think we talked about it.
But Freud does it now in many works. He does it in Civilization and His Discontent, in the later works on war, on culture in general, on religion, for example, Moses and monotheism. He does it in quite a lot of works. Even the text on Das Unheimliche, the uncanny, is a more a general cultural text where he analyzes literature and so on. So I think this, but what he calls himself meta-psychology was from the beginning there, also in Freud already. But you're right, of course, that
yes. But he has moments where he tries, he advances some theories that you can see that it's what Lacan embraces, and then he tries to get some distance from them. And then Lacan is, I think, the real sociologist of psychoanalysis in a way. And then Žižek, of course, who takes all this theory and applies it to social theory and to theory of the mass media and the mass reactions to pop culture and to culture in general. And of course, we already talked about Didi-Huberman and how he actually uses also this anachronistic kind of view of the symptom. But before that, I wanted to maybe give an example, because my girlfriend, as you know, is studying for a PhD these music programs that were on national television, in Portuguese national television, in the 70s and 80s, and that in a way first communicated classical music to the big audience. Now the thing is that until 74 we were a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship, and these programs actually started in the 60s and went well after the dictatorship ended and we transitioned to a democratic regime. And there's a lot of historians that claim that these programs were basically a wise men, educated, talking about classical music to the masses. And some historians call these practices democratizing practices, as if democracy was already happening before the revolution. Which is, I think, it's a nice idea, but it is important to say that you can only see that these practices were democratizing because there was a revolution.
Não será fácil e até gratuito considerar Haydn como figura intermediária entre o gênio e a estética de Johann Sebastian Bach e o não menor gênio, mas diferente estética de Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart? É que o problema se pode pôr também sob este aspecto. Haydn terá nascido por acaso. Naturalmente não me estou a referir aos pais. Estou a referir-me efetivamente à escola de Mannheim, representada por Stamitz. Acho que é uma grande injustiça esquecer Stamitz.
So the revolution, this change of paradigm, this shift in social status, actually reframed and renamed everything that came before. And even, or especially, I would say, the nonsensical aspects. That's what a symptom is, or what analysis actually is to try to give meaning to, as I said, to the thing that has no meaning. So if you have a dictatorship that is based on a very, very static class organization, that there's really no chance for someone to go up in the class system, and even the educational program around that the state was implementing was one of complete functionality. You had to know how to read, write, and count, and because of this, you would be a better worker and you would serve better the state. But then something that seems even contingency happens is that then why in this functional state of events, why do we have programs about classical music? What is functional about classical music? And every response that every historian tries to give has some degree of contingency. Oh, because Salazar was the dictator, was depressed for some period, and he was controlling less, or maybe the first guy who did it was already someone who had power inside the regime and just thought it would be a nice idea. There's something that happens almost by chance. But then after the revolution is not by chance anymore. After the revolution is completely justified, but only afterwards. So retroactively, we find democracy where democracy was not. And this, I think, is perfectly exemplifies the time travel that Žižek is trying to to get at, the temporality of the symptom.
Enfim, enquanto os teóricos assim discutem, isolados nas suas torres de opiniões, a música fica mais pobre porque o público se afasta dela. Os compositores mais isolados. É uma tristeza.
It's also what Freud has called this Nachträglichkeit, no? It's the idea of deferred action. It's, I think, translated into English or afterwardness. The fact that in fact history has to be always read from in a retroactive way, in a retrospective way, you can say. And I think your example is very, very interesting. I think this resonates also with an ongoing how to say, topic for Žižek. That's this idea that he links that with predestination in Lutheran theology. He brings that into Pascal. It comes back. It's this idea that history, from a sort of historicistic point, from a certain point in history, seems always contingent. And it's always from the moment that an event has happened that necessity seems to be the real drive of history. So what is interesting is that it sounds like a kind of, it resonates also with Hegel's idea of history, of a sort of teleology in history. But I think that the idea of Žižek is a sort of corrective of this a little bit stupid commonsensical teleology in Hegel. It means, in fact, that from the point of where you stand in time, things are always contingent. It's also what you call before this blind spot, or in fact, it's maybe even an element of this symptomatology of time. We are in a moment in time surrounded by symptoms. It means we are surrounded by blind spots and by things we don't understand, and they seem having a sort of protuberance, let's say, presence. They are too present almost, but we don't know what to do with them. And it's only, let's say, retroactively after the fact that they get their meaning. And so this resonates absolutely with the Nachträglichkeits principle of Freud in psychoanalysis, but of course also, and I think we move already to what in the beginning Žižek is talking about. He not only refers to Freud here, but also to Hegel. And what Hegel would call the cunning of reason is basically this what you exactly say now. It's in fact the idea that history, from the let's say the historicistic position, what would mean the historical subjects in a certain moment in time, works always through what he says. Many pages are about that, through misrecognition. You have no idea why things happen as they happen. I think our current mondial, global political situation shows continuously this dimension, that we have no clue, and even the smartest people and the people that have the most, let's say, global knowledge of political and economical status we are into, have no idea what is going on. This is not only, let's say, a typical element of our time, it's symptomatic of the time structure itself, of temporality itself. And he gives examples of that. No, it's only through misrecognition that that things get, let's say, get a sort of proper meaning. You could almost say. And there's one thing maybe that I would ask what you think about that. There is also this strange element of this cunning of reason. It goes even further than that. It's not just like, okay, things had to be necessary when we look retrospectively to them. There is a more, let's say, almost more perverted twist to the cunning of reason itself. It's namely that there is something like a sort of fatalism in it, something unavoidable in history itself. And you can say it's like, it's not just simple teleology, things have to become what they are and so on. No, it's even if you try to avoid certain things, this misrecognition or this avoidance itself will be, let's say, injected into the current of history itself. That's what, in fact, Žižek is trying to tell us, in fact. And he gives examples of that from stories. Oedipus myth is one of them. But he gives also the typical Hegelian stories of Julius Caesar, for example, who has to be two attempts to become Caesar, let's say. First, by going over the Rubicon and fighting against the Republic, against the whole Republican ethos. He will be killed. But it's exactly the killing of Julius Caesar which would lead to Caesarism, to the idea of the Roman Empire through the first emperor Augustus, Caesar Augustus. That's his first known example. Another is, of course, that of the defeat of Napoleon, where Napoleon has to be defeated twice, as if he himself misrecognized his first defeat. It's a sort of negative example, not of victory, but of defeat. And Napoleon was 2 times put into exile, no? As if he couldn't believe his own historical failure, and had to go still to Waterloo and so on. So I think this is really interesting. I don't know if you want to still say something about this dynamics of misrecognition.
Yeah, because from that arises, I think, the point that most people connected to historicism, at least in musicology, which is, I think, the field, at least I know more, and also you're involved with it, this is what they still refuse, is that what you just said means that the past is a political category, that there is no neutral, there is no possible neutral look at the past. You cannot just describe what happened and just detach yourself from it. And this whole chapter connects to a very brief review that Žižek wrote called Hegel, Retroactivity and the End of History. It is a review of a book by another Hegelian Lacanian, Don McCowan. And Žižek is completely aligned with McCowan, except in one point, and it's exactly this. And at some point, Žižek says something that I think summarizes the first part of this entire chapter, is that the present and the future is predetermined in the sense of fatality that you were talking about. We always find reasons for the things to happen. The only thing you can change is not your future, but your past. By giving new meaning to the past, by accepting that you are not a neutral observer, that every time you look at the past, you fill it with meaning that is your own, and that connects to some kind of struggle, and that is completely subjective. Every time you look at the past, you change it. And because you change it, then you create the necessity for a different future. And you see this happening in the far right very, very clearly. If you look at the past as something perfect that was lost and we should recover, then what comes is not the past that they are looking for, but a new thing. And the point with Žižek is that this should also be a leftist struggle, to really look at the past not as a neutral kind of set of events that were just there and you just look at it and you write what happened and it's this. The real radical take on history, to be really an historian, is to accept that there's nothing neutral about this past, that every time you look at it, you are changing it.
It points also at the past itself as being symptomatic or symptomal in a way. The past itself is our symptom, you can say. And history, maybe historiography, is just a curing, a way of domesticating, curing, being able to cope with this past as symptom. I think, excuse me, that's the dimension that Žižek helps us to think about. And I think also that's how you indeed what you said so nicely, and what for me always brings a sort of almost an exciting vertigo is this idea that you cannot change the present or the future to come. I mean, whatever that would even mean, but you can change the past. This seems to be such a counterintuitive idea, something that like goes to every commonsensical notion of what people imagine what the past is, namely this reservoir of facts of what we can at least be sure. And I think this is exactly the difference between, let's say, classical historiography that believes that things that happened are somehow objectively stored somewhere in a reservoir, a container of facticities that don't need any interpretation, that are just immediately there. This points at our previous episode of immediacy. Or they are moving protuberances, to use Žižek's words, that kick up, that erupt in our present situation, and that are always of the status of a symptom. And I think it's nice that you also put about that you talked about music. I often also say a little bit this boutade that music, but also early music, let's say these performances of early music, this is very much of the character of symptom, of symptomatology. And I would almost dare to say that how you, for example, see in more reactionary politics today, patrimony and culture is revived in a certain way. I think it's absolutely clear how in its expression and repression, the past is rewritten, reinscribed, redomesticated. Well, and the answer would be, of course, what could be the antidotum to that? No, I think that's we move slowly to the I think the problems that Freud and Lacan have noticed by just their clinical work, also that you can try to interpret symptoms, you can try to reintegrate them, you can try to talk about them so that they would dissolve. This is all about connecting symptoms to meaning. They have a hidden meaning, and we need to bring that to the surface. But what, and this is, I think, the Žižekian, also Lacanian point would be that, what if symptoms have no hidden meaning? What if they are already always on the surface? What if they are surface effects, so to speak, without a deeper meaning? What if they are just wounds that we scratch open? What if they are just like surface features? I think slowly Freud and Lacan understood that something else is going on there, and of course this will be the element of what Freud would call the drive of our psyche, the Trieb in German, or what then in Lacan is also pointed at with this idea of enjoyment, the fact that something else than meaning is going on in our lives. And just to give a little bit something about this enjoyment in Freud, it's very interesting that also this has to do with symptoms and with history. It's known that the theory of the drive in Freud was developed by Freud exactly after this traumatic experience of the First World War. So it was exactly after 1918, I think, the book where he started to really understand something about the drive structures. What is drive? It's this, you can also say it's, with another word, is the death drive. It's this element of something we are stuck with. So it's absolutely linked with symptoms. We are stuck with. It's also maybe the stickiness of the drive. There's this notion that I like a lot when Freud talks about the Klebrigkeit of the drive, the stickiness of the drive. And this stickiness is absolutely something that we we feel already the Žižekian rhetorics here, this kind of dirty thing we cannot get rid of, you know, like after the First World War, with the symptoms that he recognized with the soldiers that came back from the tranchées, from the battlefield, where they had shell shock and where they had this kind of repetitive compulsion symptoms, he started to understand that symptoms are not so much linked to meaning, because they are so displaced and they are so much like what he then develops in the dream analysis. No, they have these notions of condensation and displacement and so on. So meaning seems not to be the first thing to be important, but something else seems to be important, namely what we also recognize in repetition. Why do we want to repeat some things? Why do we repeat always to listen to the same music on and on? Why do we repeat certain actions? Why do we find ourselves repeating certain things we say to our beloveds, or when we are angry, or we have certain tics that we repeat and that others probably see, and so on. So it's not only the shift from meaning to drive and to enjoyment. Enjoyment doesn't mean just pleasure. It means something much more awful sometimes. It's pleasure and displeasure mixed. It's pleasure in displeasure and displeasure in pleasure, and so on. This very dialectical knotted idea. What I wanted to say is then also still is that what was I lost my thread now. That's a symptom, no, of
you're going on about enjoyment.
This element of enjoyment. But maybe just to go back still, I don't know if because we move slowly to the problems of it. Maybe that Freud discovers this after the First World War. I find it also very intriguing that there is this empirical element also there. It's not just a sort of speculative theory. It's something that it's linked to one of the most traumatic moments in the 20th century, even if not the most traumatic. So quite impact, at least, because people had never gone through such a devastating thing as this 4 years war in between 1914 and 1918, of course. But so this element, I think it's really, really important, that something else is going on with the symptom.
That breaks some homeostasis. No, that's I think that's his point. So it's basically the deconstruction that Freud does to his own theory at the end of his career, where he finds, as you were saying, these soldiers repeating the same these symptoms that they gained during the war, these traumas, always come back through this post-traumatic disorder that makes them go beyond the pleasure principle. And that's enjoyment, is, as you were saying, is pleasure with displeasure, is something that causes you suffering, but still you cannot stop doing it. And this, I think, is the, let's say, this relation is what, and maybe we can already talk about it. This relation is what makes Lacan offer different definitions of symptom between the 1950s and the 1970s, because he's always involved and he's always asking himself, why, after I give the meaning to these symptoms, why don't they go away? Why they keep coming back? And then he tries to detach enjoyment and symptom. He tries to treat both things separately. He tries to make the patient realize that the other also doesn't know, this traversing of the fundamental fantasy, as he calls it, and still it fails. and it's always like why these symptoms keep occurring. That's the question.
I think that's what I forgot before. Forgetting is also a symptom, no? Like when that's already a symptom, a sign of repression. But so what I in fact was repressing there was that this idea that what you say also now, that for Lacan also in the beginning, symptoms are always, let's say expressions towards another, towards an imaginary other, a big other that would give you an explanation. You can say also that's why you go with your symptoms to the analyst, because the analyst would be this person that would give meaning to your symptoms. So it's a little bit like it's something that I think, for example, people that cut themselves on their arms, for example, these signs on the arms, they are, you can say in this kind of interpretation, they look like traces or like wounds that are addressed to somebody. No, often people that have these scars on their arms, they don't hide them. They somehow show them. So there is an element of expression of the symptom there. And what I find very interesting is that, of course, you could say that's maybe the hysterical symptom, is that the person who has the scratches doesn't know either what they mean and why they are addressed to the other and how they are addressed to the other. But they are just there and it's almost that you scream to an imaginary other to say, tell me what they mean, in a way. Like tell me what my scratches mean to me or to you, first of all. And then maybe through transference, they would also mean something to you. This mechanism is very interesting, but as you really nicely also explained and explored this, that I think this became more and more problematic for Lacan. It's that there came a sort of like, let's say, a sort of conceptual doubt about this idea that symptoms are really addressed to somebody else. And I think that's also how he then gets to the Symptom. And by the way, maybe just now to connect also still this to your thing on page 80. So that's after this little summary that he gives on page 80. He says exactly what you said now, that he first tried the first time when he started to understand that this beyond the pleasure principle element is working in the symptom, he still tried to stick to some he still tried to understand symptom away from fantasy. I don't know if you recall this passage. So it's still that he starts first to let's say understand this enjoyment as part of fantasy, that could then be worked through. That's a typical thing. We have to traverser how is it, traversing the fantasy? I think it's in English called the traversing the profound or the fundamental fantasy. No, and so he tries still to dissolve something there, something that can be still disconnected somehow or alleviated, or how you want to say it. And it's interesting that Žižek also repeats this idea that even if people have traversed the fantasy, symptoms still seem to reappear. So there is a sort of really, again, this stickiness, a sort of stubbornness of the symptom, that even when you have worked till the end of analysis to traverse the fantasy, they are still reappearing. And I love also what he says there. One moment, he says something that people love to talk. So symptoms for people are mostly discomforting, like, and very annoying, but they love to talk about them. They love to talk to friends, my symptoms, this and that. With fantasy, it's the opposite. Fantasy is mostly something really pleasurable. You have all these fantasies in whatever sexual fantasies, but you are ashamed to talk about it. And I think this, I found that that's for me also the genius of Žižek there, that's on page 80, that he, with simple examples, in fact, with simple sort of homologies, makes things that look very difficult. How would you try to explain the difference between symptom and fantasy, for example, that in the way they are let's say, how they function and how they are used in daily life, it's so clear how this difference comes to the surface. Can I still add something about that? Because I think we didn't give so much examples, I think, from Žižek yet, and that's also something that I found really intriguing, is that we talked already about that also, but the idea how Žižek reworks Lacanian and Freudian theory through examples. The Titanic reappears. There are examples from Kafka again. There are examples from science fiction books. But what is so intriguing is that it seems to be that every time he finds an example, I guess this is the intuitive moment of resonance, that suddenly he thinks of another thing. There's a kind of like a sort of electric flash of inspiration. But it's through working through these examples that he pushes the original Freudian and Lacanian theory to total different terrains and total different, even conceptually he changes them. I think that's what we were struggling also with the previous days, that often we are confronted with an example in Žižek that has to illustrate a theoretical element, symptom, whatever, fantasy. And then we go through this example, and we seem to end up on a total different terrain or domain. I think this is not the failure of his theorizing.
It's contrary,
It's his grandeur, and it's where I would say we have. So I think that's Pfaller also, Robert Pfaller, who we talked before about, that he also says that in some article, that the grandeur of the theory is that he elevated the example, the exemplum, like it's something in casuistics, no, the casus. You find that in scholastic philosophy and in theology also, this idea of the casus, the exemplum, to the level of let's say true theory. In fact, like
theory itself.
Theory itself, exactly.
You're completely right, and it's funny how all these examples also can be related to psychoanalytical, almost even clinical practice. You can talk about them as a psychoanalyst, but they also have this double function of opening for social theory. And then these two dimensions are completely synthesized in the examples he gives. Even if, and that's I think the funny part, is that he takes one example, he develops it, and he never finishes it, and he takes another one, and they basically we have this with the connection from Kafka to Parsifal, to this wound of Amfortas that he talks about. This wound that basically is what Amfortas is about, and it's very own to himself, and also
we have to still. I think we should go in detail on that when we talk about the Symptom, no? I think
yes, that's true.
Maybe we can still wrap up first this first part. I don't know if we.
I don't know if you want to talk about the Titanic or if it's.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because Titanic is the example here of Titanic is a sort of what it's very ingenious also what he does there, and then you can immediately say what it exactly is. But what I find ingenious is that it's a nice passage because it stitches together the contingency necessity of history, this whole thing that he talks about with the cunning of reason in Hegel, how history functions, how symptoms are becoming symbols in culture. But then also at the same time how something doesn't work, doesn't get so it's like Titanic from symptom to symbol. It becomes this symbol, or it has been always already, like it was already taken up. But then, nevertheless, not everything seems to be capable of being taken up. So I think this is maybe something that, before you go to the Titanic example, let me just finish this idea of the symptom as a meaningful or potentially meaningful thing with two art historians that I still wanted to mention, because I think it's maybe for our viewers and listeners interesting that that the symptom as a readable and decodable thing from that comes from Freud. I think there are two really interesting art historians that have written and talked about that in these two different ways. Like say, one is more a sort of old school Freudian way, and the other is then the more Lacanian problematizing way. The first is Carlo Ginsburg. He has a book called, I have it in Dutch here, but there is an English. I will put it in our. I will put it here with the English title. Carlo Ginsburg is an Italian cultural theorist and art historian who wrote a very interesting text. It's a very famous text for cultural theory about traces, where he brings Panofsky, Sherlock Holmes, with clues in the whodunit and so on, and together with the symptom of Freud. So you get the symptom in painting with Panofsky. You get that is decodable for iconology. You get in early detective Conan Doyle stories of Sherlock Holmes the idea of clues with which we can read a murder case, and then you have the Freudian symptom. So this is let's say the classical way that symptom is used. And then there is the second way. I think this is the more Lacanian way. That's, you mentioned him already, Georges Didi-Huberman, and he has, it's like a sort of becomes a kind of book program, no? This, you know, when they show these books, no? Like The Surviving Image. There's this book where he links the traumatized Freud from after the First World War, the symptomatic Freud, the Freud of beyond the pleasure principle, with a very intriguing figure from art history, namely Aby Warburg, who was an art historian, but who was, in fact, let's say, the Freud of iconology, you can almost say, of art, like iconography. And there is also something really interesting there that you can say, as Freud himself is maybe a sort of symptom, I would almost say that Aby Warburg, as Didi-Huberman reworks him and so on, is also the symptom of art history. It's like as if Aby Warburg, and that is so intriguing, I think maybe we will once spend an episode on that, that Aby Warburg is this symptom of art history that has to be, on the one hand, it expresses what it is all about in art history. On the other hand, it has to be repressed. Art history itself cannot grapple with this symptom of Aby Warburg because his ideas and concepts are in fact almost too traumatic because they are liquid. There is a sort of leaking of the image through time. It's not confined nicely in a historical temporal framework and so on. So yeah, so Aby Warburg, somebody absolute to check out. But now let's go to the Titanic.
I think the way Žižek tries to frame the Titanic is as a symptom of capitalism. Is this boat that represents Western civilization, the technological advancement, the unthinkable status quo, but also represents a complete, static, and very well-defined class system that rich people know have this part of the boat. The workers of the boat have all these other parts. No one mixes. Everything is perfect. And then this boat sinks. What's funny is that the Titanic as a thing, as something that means that is more in itself than itself, only appears as a sunken boat, as this ruin, and it's culturally the amount of people who try to come back to this image, the fascination people have with this image, I think is a true symptom of capitalism. How this dream of perfection and technological advancement and class systems that are completely defined and predictable kind of hide below the sea, and people still try to get at it. And the poetic, I think if this was scripted, it wouldn't be as interesting. The poetic aspect of these billionaires going to the Titanic, trying to recover this dream of capitalism, of Western capitalism, and they themselves implode in this impossibility.
Maybe still something to add is also that Žižek uses it in a way that it also shows the anachronism of the symptom. It's almost for him too nice when he says that the real sinking of the boat was anticipated by apparently a novel before,
Yes.
which prescribes almost as a recipe completely what would happen. And this boat was in this novel called Titan.
Yeah.
This is so crazy, in fact. So that this, of course, like you can say, how nice for his anachronistic, let's say, pointing at the symptom is that well, the story goes anticipates the truth here. It's like the true event is not a story after a true event. It's like the story comes first. And this also reminds me of this. We talked about that, and maybe it brings us also to the next step. Then that this other war poet, this French war poet, Joe Bousquet, who that's a thing that Deleuze in one of his books, I think it's in Logique du Sens. Strangely enough, Žižek, by my knowledge, never quoted this, but it would fit totally in this reversal of facts, like almost like in Tenet of Nolan, Christopher Nolan. No? Yeah. Another example of where time is reversed. Namely that Joe Bousquet, who was wounded, as he was a poet, a French surrealist poet, and got really severely wounded in the First World War, which made him, in fact, handicapped for his whole life. He was always in his bed. There are pictures of him and he said once, he has this wonderful quote. He says, "Look, the wound existed before me, and I am just born to embody or to incarnate this wound." And so you get this idea of this floating symptom, this wound that exists before me. It's almost like in the story of Titanic, that the Titanic as a symptom has existed before its true incarnation. It's always as
actualized. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And symptom is always this element that exists before and that has then to become. But of course, and then I think maybe you can immediately continue with that. There is this idea; it became such a huge symbol, the Titanic. So we could say the symptom got incarnated into this real thing, which then become the symbol of, let's say, the end of civilization, the industrial capitalism that was failing, whatever. It already previews the First World War because it happened in 1912. And so, but then that's not the end of the story, right? It's what you say, there is this element of jouissance there, no?
Exactly. Yes, that is completely connected with non-knowledge, the thing you don't understand about it. That's what creates jouissance. There are so many sunken boats in the sea, but why Titanic emerges as this figure? Why specifically this boat? And that's what people cannot really explain. This ungraspable of the object that then gives it a greater than itself.
Now that we talk about it, I had to suddenly, I don't know what you think about that. Is there not something of, is a symptom not always working, the enjoyment of the symptom, does it not have to do with ruin and ruination and the fact that something, that of course symptom is that what breaks into the symbolic order, it's something that cannot be, so it sticks out, it's something that, and is not therefore also that it's connected to enjoyment, because it erupts, it brings a kind of it cracks down. It's like you would almost say, like, knowledge, meaning, the symbolic as such are not bringing enjoyment, they bring pleasure in its controlling, like as also Freud described it. No, it's a sort of lowering of the pressure of excitement. So it's a sort of balancing of excitement, the pleasure principle. And then all these other elements like ruins, maybe that's also why a Gothic cathedral is so enjoyment producing, because it looks like not fitting. It looks broken. The towers are not symmetric. While maybe a classical symmetric temple is, according to the pleasure principle, it's beautiful, but it doesn't bring anything beyond beauty. While the sublime always has to do with this element of sticking out, dirty, it smells, it doesn't work.
Yes, and I think our relationship to Lacan can also be that there's something that uh, escapes. There's a meaning that makes no that doesn't make sense. There's something there, and Hegel as well. I think these two. It's not a coincidence that Žižek took these two. Probably the two most famous philosophers or theoreticians uh, for the difficulty of what they say, the almost hieroglyphic kind of way of thinking that uh, completely connects us to them. No, if they were simple to understand, I would think they would have been forgotten by now, maybe. Uh, and Zizek, being a lot simpler than Lacan and Hegel, of course, but he keeps, as you were saying with these examples, he keeps some mystery. He
History or mystery?
mystery.
Okay.
He still keeps these ungraspable, and that's I think what we were trying to get at when you were mentioning his art of taking the example or the exemplum as a theory in itself. It's this mystery that creates enjoyment, and maybe I would say this can be the perfect entry to the Symptom, because the Symptom has exactly this aspect, the thing that you cannot interpret. Even if you did, that would not be a good thing to do. It would lead into psychosis, into the dissolving of language and of the symbolic, uh, because it's who you are. The Symptom is who you are, basically. And uh, Zizek shows, and Lacan, or Zizek through Lacan, shows how this Symptom is how we create something out of nothing. How reality itself is structured around a void. Uh, and this dynamics is what creates some kind of misrecognition that provokes enjoyment and that makes us hold this something that is created out of nothing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it's indeed it's a nice entry to this notion of Symptom. Just because as I said in the beginning, no, page 79, that's the page where you go, the transition where he explains how Lacan slowly works himself through from symptom to Symptom. But as many analysts or theorists would also claim, is that you can say that it's late Lacan, and Lacan does that in fact all the time in his career, is that he reworks his concepts. And this makes it not easier for people who want to work with these concepts, because, for example, there is one of the concepts he also claims he invented is his objet, the object cause of desire, as he says. But the problem is that how it starts with objet and how it ends, it's a total different thing. And so you can in fact not just universalize this concept. There is always something, maybe that's the historicistic symptom in Lacan, that something sticks when you talk about, when you want to try to use this concept in a generalized way. I think we also struggled the previous days with that a little bit, is that, yeah, you always have to say you have to always talk about, yeah, but this is the Lacan of this period and so on. So there is, funny enough, you can say maybe that's one of these the cunning of Lacan, is that he inscribed himself as a symptom in the use of his concepts, because you can hardly use them without referring to the biography of Lacan. So yeah, well, let's not go into that. But and I think what is very typical is that in the end of his career, so we are in the middle of the 70s, 75, I think, if I'm right, the seminar on the Symptom. It's a seminar on James Joyce, basically. And it's a seminar on mostly on one book of James Joyce, the most crazy, unreadable book, by the way, a book that Žižek absolutely hates. And I think basically he is absolutely not a fan of James Joyce. It's very interesting that the Ljubljana school always prefers Samuel Beckett, the student of James Joyce, much before James Joyce. And I think, Luís, you also showed me this nice text of Mladen Dolar, another very important figure that we always mention in every episode almost, where he proposes a corrective on the late Lacan, not that he should have, almost a sort of what-if situation, like a sort of counterfactual. The idea that what Lacan should have really been doing in the end of his career was not tackling James Joyce, but would have been tackling Samuel Beckett. And so Mladen Dolar has this very funny and punning text where he tries to do that, tries to work through this late Lacanian theory through the work of Samuel.
It's called Nothing Has Changed.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, that's a very wonderful text on the side, I would say. But so here is the seminar on James Joyce, the Symptom. The last text in this in this book of the seminars is, by the way, a lecture that was outside of the seminars of Lacan, and he called there the lecture is called Joyce the Symptom, and it brings a little bit together. The whole idea is that Joyce, the name of Joyce is himself, or is itself the Symptom. In fact, that's the sort of conclusion that Lacan comes with, and it's indeed what you already nicely summarized, this idea of how not to fall in psychosis. We are in the 70s. This is the time of Gilles Deleuze, of the anti-Oedipus, of real bashing of not only of psychoanalysis as a very patriarchal, paternalizing, bourgeois phenomenon, but it also pushed, I think, Lacan to rethink his whole theory. And I feel a huge underground push of this Deleuzian endeavor, in fact. And what you see is that he tries to rethink psychoanalysis, you could almost say, beyond what he would call the name of the father, beyond the paternal signifier, and so on. And Joyce is interesting because we were talking about that yesterday. No, is the Symptom to be found in the end of analysis? Is the Symptom connected to analysis, to psychoanalysis, or is it appearing outside of analysis? And I think one of the interesting conclusions is, in fact, that it's typically maybe even outside of analysis, because what Lacan claims is that James Joyce was mad, but not psychotic, and that he, through his artistic endeavor, through his writing, which Lacan would almost identify with a sort of self-analysis, would work himself through beyond what he would then say, beyond the paternal signifier, beyond even, like, let's say, the barring of this signifier, as you would work through in analysis, if you would just go to a classical Lacanian analysis. But Lacan, James Joyce did that on himself, so to speak. And so, so then he invents this crazy word, symptôme, which sounds in French almost like symptôme. Symptôme also, it's symptôme, that is the later concept, and symptôme, which is with the circonflexe on the O, which is the old French, the normal French, symptôme. Symptôme, symptôme. Symptôme, of course, sounds like holy man also in French, no? Symptôme. He also connects that with Saint Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century philosopher. And just one little anecdote to point at why is that connected to Aquinas. There is this nice anecdote, and I like that. One moment, Aquinas had written the Summa Theologica, all his work and so on, and then he got, apparently, in the end of his life, a sort of mystical vision. And this was so for him such a total shock and a change of his life that he dismissed all his theoretical works, Aquinas, and he called it, they are for me sicut palea, like manner or like trash. And I think this is something that is very important for the late Lacan. Maybe in other episodes we will still come on that. The idea of trash, the idea of manner or litter, the fact that in the end you are connected to some waste element, to some remnant. And who is connected to that? It's the Symptom, the holy man, the saint. The saint is this figure that would, in the television episode that he made, he says somewhere, the holy man is not connected to caritas in the English translation, as we mostly think of medieval people, not good people, they do charity, caritas, but they are connected to trashitas, he says in the English translation.
Yeah, it's like this video of Žižek saying true ecologists love the trash, and because he's like with his yellow thing in front, I think, of a trash or a pile of trash, and he says true ecologists love this. This is what means to embrace the shit, basically, the things that your phantom pains, as I think we said in the beginning.
True ecologist loves all this.
And maybe this brings us these are already nice examples of what Symptom means. This new, it's this idea. I think you said in the beginning already. It is also, and I would like to repeat that there is something of what Lacan would call then. He would not say it's external to us. He would call it extimate. The Symptom is extimate. It means that it's at the same time outside of us. We have no connection, it seems, to it. It's there in front of us like a symptom, but at the same time it totally identifies us. It's totally what we are. And there is this idea that in the end of analysis also, you would not anymore try to dissolve your symptoms or to get to the true meaning of them, but you would just let them live, let them be there, and you would just identify with them.
Yeah, exactly. And this is, I think, connects to the example I was introducing before. This Amfortas from Parsifal is a man who has a wound, and there's this famous setting of Parsifal done by Silverberg. I think that's how the name is said.
Yeah, Zuberberg. Yeah.
Zuberberg. Yeah. Who takes Amfortas and externalizes the wound. So the wound is an object that the character that plays Amfortas, or the actor that plays Amfortas, has to take with him as like this extra thing that he always has. And Žižek points, he quotes a bit of Parsifal, and this at some point Amfortas opens his garment, and he says, "Here I am, here is the open wound. Here flows my blood that poisons me. Draw your weapons, plunge your swords in deep up the hilt." And this "here I am, here is the open wound" is the moment where Amfortas really sees that the wound is not something not to get rid of, but it's who he is. And that's what a Symptom means, is how did we survive all these traumatic lives we had, which entry into the symbolic, entry into language is itself traumatic. How do we make sense? How do we create something out of nothing? And it's also, there's a moment in the text of Žižek that I like very much, where he says that philosophy is organized around the triangle. You have the world, language, and the subject. And the typical criticism of Lacan, or the critics of Lacan say about him, is that Lacan pretends that the world does not exist. That he only takes language and is, as I think we said about in the first episode, this idea of abstraction, and Lacan's response is, yes, it doesn't exist, but also the language and also the subject, they do not exist. Everything is reeled with negativity. Everything is a negative, and the symptom is the only thing that exists. The symptom is the nodule, the knot that we grab onto, and that makes us not go psychotic. So we are all mad in this Joyce sense, but we are not psychotic. We still can function because of our symptom or our symptoms.
Yeah, and this is a nice way of also to show how Lacan anticipates the whole problem of identity politics, isn't it?
Yeah.
The fact that
Precisely.
it's not that he says we don't need identity politics. It's not a refusal. In fact, he also moves to certain, you can say, it's almost as if he already understood how important it is. It's also typical in the 70s, I guess, that we cannot just, once we have rid ourselves from the paternal signifier, from patriarchy, what then? What happens then? No, like, and I think he somehow saw this. He saw the rise of identity politics as a typical answer to this, and he understood that there is some mechanism of the signifier, the master signifier, which has to be taken up by the individual itself, which has to be singularized or whatever, and that's quite incredible that he somehow already gives an answer before identity politics had manifested itself, with all its problems, with all its biases and false conceptions of me, myself, and I, and so on. I don't know if you still wanted to say something, or how that works, like the fact that he says, in fact, really, I am my symptom.
Exactly.
I identify with the thing that is, in fact, je est un autre, to talk with Rimbaud, but this autre is something in me. It is my identity. You can say, in fact, there is an identity politics of Lacan. The only thing is that it's inside twisted. There is a sort of...
Yes, because Lacan proposes not that, and I think this is the most important aspect of this theory, is not about seeing your identity as a substantial thing. And that's, I think, the bad identity politics, is that I identify as this, and this is who I am completely, as a substance. Lacan gives it a shift, says, yes, this is who you are, but not as a substance. You have to realize that it is a fantasy that you make of yourself, and you have to identify with it, of course. But this twist that you go through analysis, and I think it's what we said before in the previous episode, this turn of, it's a 360 degrees turn, is that you accept who you are, knowing that this who you are is not a substantial thing, is just a construction that you put on top of nothing. And this, I think, is a very, very crucial aspect of his theory.
That's really interesting. Maybe just to end with something is what you, in fact, what I started to see yesterday when we were talking, and I got myself a little bit in a total crisis. I couldn't get out, and then thanks to you, in fact, what does it mean to identify with the Symptom, no? And then I think what you showed me very well is that, in fact, the state, what would be the best way of expressing this, being with your Symptom? And then yesterday, by giving you the interpretation you gave of these amphoras and the fact that this guy is lamenting and complaining about, but nevertheless is faithful to this wound that keeps on bleeding, and as long as it keeps bleeding, he cannot die, so to speak. But there is this affirmation of it. But the beauty of it, and now I start to understand that finally, is that the beauty is in the complaint. In fact, it's all about, so you can almost say, and this reminds me of another book by Aaron Schuster. There is a wonderful book by Aaron Schuster called The Trouble with Pleasure, where he tries in a incredible, ingenious way to connect the thinking of Deleuze with that of Lacan. And it starts with a sort of éloge on the lamentation, on the complaint. And I never really understood that so well. I know there is a whole, there's a funny moment when Deleuze in the Abécédaire that he filmed in the end of his life, where he says, they ask him, what do you would like to be if you would not be a philosopher? What would you like to be? And he says, I would have liked to be a pleureuse, like a mourner.
Alors à ce moment-là, naît la grande plainte. Aïe, 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 aïe. Mais c'est pas la douleur qu'ils ont. C'est une espèce de chance. C'est pour ça que c'est une source poétique. Moi, j'aurais pas été philosophe ou j'aurais été une femme. J'aurais voulu être une pleureuse. La pleureuse, c'est merveilleux parce que la plainte monte, c'est un art, quoi. Et puis, ça a un côté un peu perfide. Ça veut dire, vous chargez pas de me plaindre, me touchez pas. C'est un peu comme les gens trop polis.
And there is this complaint in Deleuze all the time. And I think this is exactly so much near to the Symptom of Lacan.
Yeah.
And so you can...
And especially to the twist that Žižek gives it, how it turns the Symptom into ideology itself. I think this, what you just said, I think it's crucial.
Yeah, because in the end, because now that we are talking of politics, he has there this whole chapter still on, or the subchapter on enlightenment. You can say enlightenment would be still, in its very naive form, a false way of being political. Although Žižek would, of course, embrace all the rationality and the rational grounding and values of enlightenment, what he criticizes very deeply through the Symptom is the fact that it seems to be engaged in creating a transgressive symptom through which it can deeply enjoy. So it seems as if it's like stripped of any enjoyment, but then there is this dirty underside of enlightenment as this obedience to a senseless law, which in fact the obedience to the senseless law, as he says, would become Nazism, let's say. This is the typical openly obedience to a senseless law. But in enlightenment itself, it's, let's say, in this whole philosophy of enlightenment, it's still obfuscated. It's hidden, you can say. In Descartes, it's hidden in Kant and so on. So, and I think maybe this brings us also to art and to what interests us, music. There is this true Symptom maybe in the lamentation. And maybe to be really political today, it's not just to embrace enlightenment, to embrace whatever you want, modernity, but also to be able to lament and just to end with, we ended one time already with Nymphes des Bois. I discovered something incredible. In fact, last week we are working on an analysis. I think we will publish it very soon, Luís, as we were talking about the idea that one moment in this lament of Josquin Desprez, Nymphes des Bois, something incredible happens. I would say a symptom pops out suddenly. It's namely on the moment that the singers are. There are two versions of the text, but the text that we once recorded interests me the more. He says that Atropos, that's the king of the dark world, the god of the darkness, has taken Ockeghem in his trap, or in her trap. I think it's a female figure. I think Atropos, and then he says the true treasure and masterpiece of music, that's Ockeghem, Who, Ockeghem, he says in the text, who from the dead no longer escapes, qui de trépas désormais plus n'échappe. And exactly on the moment of the échappe, something, so échappe means escape, on that moment in the music, something escapes. I would almost say like a symptom escapes. And it's exactly before the text continues, for whom great mourning covers the earth, dont grand dommage et que la terre couvre. So when we put Ockeghem back in the grave, just between the moment the text says he cannot escape death and he's put in the grave, the earth is covering him, something happens. And how is that musically happening? It is through what Edward Lewinsky once called secret chromaticism. It is a sort of chromatic move from an E to an E flat, what you call in a false relation. It means it's not in one voice but in two different voices. So it's a sliding down of an E to an E flat. And this happens on an incredible moment. All the voices disappear on that moment, and the voice, as you so nicely said in the previous episode, that sings the voice of Ockeghem, the Cantus Firmus is Requiem, suddenly pops up goes up suddenly, ascends out of everything, like a sort of phantomal move or a symptomal move, and sings there, repeats this E that is already sung by another voice just before, and then this E becomes an E flat in the next beat. So you get a sort of slowly cracking down of the whole thing through this sort of resurrection, this phantomal reappearance of the father figure, almost, you can say, who is then put again in the grave. Well, I think it's a very nice example of how Josquin, a composer from the 16th century, you can say much before modernity, so-called, much before the rise of capitalist symptoms, somehow works Lamentations, which I think we came to the idea that it's the perfect genre of the Sinthome, stitches inside symptomal elements, you can say, which in fact, in the end, make out the weird character of such a piece. And you can say, is it audible? It's somehow audible, but that's also very interesting. It's not audible in a conscious way. And you would say, exactly. Is that not how the symptom also works? The symptom has a presence. It's something that is there. It has an uncanny status, but it's, let's say, not yet taken up. And of course, music is very well into that. I think, by the way, that Lawrence Kramer, when he talks about, who stole, by the way, the whole chapter of Žižek, of the Sublime Object, Amfortas, Kafka is there. He doesn't mention him, but okay. But he points also at chromaticism, weird leaps in the melody, which are in music often the sign of, well, you can say a musical symptomatology.
Yes. I'm just also trying to imagine the song in my head, just to come back to this moment. But it is, I think, what you mentioned about pleureuse, because the pleureuse also involves some crying that feels real when you are crying it, even if you know it's for the other, no. And it's this blind spot, I think, that builds it as the symptom. Is that, and there's one in the last page of the chapter. It says, Žižek says, as soon as they perceive that the real goal is the consistency of the ideological attitude itself, the effect is self-defeating. So as soon as you know why you are crying, everything goes away. So this unknowing, and I was joking this week with you, because we are recording this in the week that the Pope was elected, and people were in the St. Peter's Square just crying of happiness for the new Pope, even if no one knew at this time who it was. So they were all defending different kinds of Pope. People wanted more traditional popes. People wanted popes more like Pope Francis. And before everyone knew who is going to be, the white smoke just made people go crazy and just crying of happiness. And we have a new Pope. Everything is nice again. And if you ask these people, why are you crying? And of course they would say, oh, because I was really happy and I was really... but you cannot ask too much, because if you take it away, then everything stops making sense. So this, and also in these cryings, we already described of the funerals of kings that still exist today. People cry collectively for the kings. There is a sense of, to go back to the first or to the last episode, there is a sense of immediacy when you cry. No, there's a sense of you are doing it for real because you are crying. There's an emotional attachment to it.
And the Pope has just to be elected to embody the symptom of the people, right?
Precisely, exactly. That's exactly my point. It's the thing that it comes before the thing.
Maravillosa. Se lo esperaba. No, no tan rápido. Muy emocionado.